a double feature because you're going to hear an inspiring testimony of a changed life. You also get to enjoy some good music. So that is just ahead of the broadcast. A new friend that I've connected with, and the story and how this happened it's just incredible. I'll share that with you just a few minutes from now. Speaking of friends, we're turning now to 9th District Congressman Dan Bishop, who is joining us on the program. We mentioned just a few minutes ago the fact that Congress, the House at least, has passed this $1.9 trillion stimulus bill. Now, this legislation still has to pass the Senate, but it's out of the hands of the House anyway. One person probably not too pleased with this legislation is Dan Bishop, who is joining us now. Good morning. Welcome, sir.
Good morning, my friend Vince. Good to be with you.
Well, first off, what were your, overall thoughts on this legislation?
Well, one thought was we finished voting on it a little after 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, and then I got on an airplane at about 6:45. But that's just adds a punctuation point. Vince, this, you mentioned the price tag, another $1.9 trillion of indebtedness for America. And somebody told me, I think wisely, as I began serving in Congress at some point, to never use the figure $1 trillion without telling people what that means. That's $8,000 for every family, every household in America. So it's another, and we've passed, I voted for the CARES Act last year, bipartisan consensus bill in the depths of the emergency brought on by the pandemic. We are now at the phase of the pandemic where the vaccines are working, case counts are dropping rapidly, American people are ready to get back to work, the economy is surging. This particular bill it contains endless payoffs for political purposes, and it's terrible policy, and it doesn't respond to COVID. So they appropriated $130 billion for K-12 education. Only 5% of that money is to be spent in the current fiscal year, which would be through September. So it doesn't even get kids back to school. That would be the obvious thing to do now, and yet what you see is endless amounts of monetary commitments into future years and for purposes that are unrelated to resolving the pandemic and getting America back.
Dan Bishop, it seems like, and there are some who have made this argument, especially with the things that you mentioned at the beginning. We've got now a third vaccine that is about to go into circulation, and really, it looks like a good number of our problems could simply be solved by, guess what? By opening up the country. Is it really that simple? Do we need to spend $1.9 trillion to do what supposedly will stimulate the economy?
Vince, just to give the appropriate nod to it, there are people who have suffered economically very badly, and as this thing drags on, they need help. So there needs to be targeted help to people. And I think for some, the $1,400 checks that will come will be unnecessary. For some, they will be absolutely necessary. But I thought, to your point, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, said it extraordinarily well at CPAC. If you want to reopen schools, just open the doors. We really don't need. I mean, the previous legislation that we've passed has about, I think the figure is about $80 billion in it, or $78 billion for K-12 schools, most of which has been unspent. So they haven't been. Just open the doors. Let's get kids back to school. Or you could consider, one of the things that I offered, it was an amendment, reintroduced a bill that I introduced the previous session called the Choice Act, which would have set aside 10% of all of education funding in COVID education relief funding to provide to parents whose kids have not been able to go back to in-person instruction. Let them get in a learning pod or homeschool them or and purchase materials or get into a private school or perhaps a church school let's get them back to school in some way. But they wouldn't even hear that amendment.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing here. We're talking with a congressman who is very concerned about what is happening with our money, Dan Bishop. And one of the other subjects that was discussed is the $15 an hour minimum wage. It was passed in the House legislation, and it looks like this has an uncertain future because the parliamentarian says this will not be acceptable for the Senate to do the reconciliation process. I would assume that you would be concerned about passage of that as well.
Well, it's another good point, another good example, Vince, of using Rahm Emanuel's old saying, never let a crisis go to waste. So you can debate minimum wages. When you get them very high at all, and they end up costing jobs. So why is that done in a bill that is touted as saving America in the midst of a pandemic? But as you say, the ruling of the parliamentarian under the Byrd rule is that the Senate can't consider it in this special reconciliation process that allows the Democrats to pass a sharply partisan measure on a party line vote without getting the necessary 60 votes to overcome the filibuster in the Senate. I will say, sitting in the cloakroom with other members, I heard predictions that the Vice President Kamala Harris, sitting in the chair, can merely overrule the parliamentarian in the Senate. Now, that will be an important breach of their rules if something like that occurs, but that is a possibility Americans should be on the lookout for.
I'm certainly glad you've made us aware of that. Unfortunately, we only have about 30 seconds left. I wanted to get your quick thoughts on Syria and the military action taken by the Biden administration there.
So I'm a believer that we need to repeal these authorizations to use military force that have been sitting around for a decade or 20 years or more. The president does have constitutional authority to respond to threats, but we don't know. Nobody really knows what they did there. It looks to me like the Forever Wars crowd is back in the White House, and that's about the only significance I can call to it right now. It seems to be trifling when President Trump used military force in Syria. I wasn't sure that was a great idea, but he was responding to the use of chemical weapons against children. I thought that was a different ball game. I just think we ought to be very restrained in our use of military force, and the White House should be consulting with Congress and explaining the reasons.
And I think millions of Americans probably feel very much the same way. Congressman Dan Bishop, 9th District Congressman, joining us on the broadcast this morning. Thanks for getting up and joining us early on the broadcast today, sir.
Thank you, Ben. Good to talk to you.
And still